On the fourth night of the Whitmore Valley blizzard, Caleb Rourke was outside. Not for wood, not for the animals, which were secured and would remain secured until morning. He was outside on the north wall of his cabin in wind that had been sustained for 60 hours and showed no intention of having reached its conclusion, packing sawdust into a gap that had opened between the inner and outer wall courses on the upper northwest corner, where the wind load was greatest, and where the settling of the sawdust fill over the previous 3 days of temperature cycling had created a void. A void let cold through. Cold that got through was heat lost. Heat lost was wood burned. Wood burned was the margin between a 7-day blizzard managed and a 7-day blizzard survived at cost. He packed the gap by lantern and feel, the way he had packed every gap across the 2 weeks in October when he had finished the double wall, not by sight, which was limited in the lantern's reach, but by the resistance the sawdust gave his paddle when the void was filled, and the slightly different resistance it gave when the fill was insufficient. He had learned this difference in October. He was applying it in January. His dog stood at the cabin corner with the specific composure of a dog that does not approve of being outside in this weather, and has decided that the most useful form of disapproval is presence rather than noise. Caleb finished the northwest corner at the second hour of the fourth night. He checked the northeast corner, sound. He went inside. The interior temperature, measured at the thermometer, he had mounted on the interior north wall at chest height, read 44 degrees. Outside, by his estimate from the behavior of the moisture on the window glass, it was somewhere below 0. He noted both figures in the ledger he kept on the shelf beside the door. He banked the stove to the overnight rate, the small, sustained burn that the double wall made sufficient, and that the single-wall cabins in the valley below would not have been finding sufficient on the fourth night of the storm. Then he noted one more thing in the ledger. Northwest corner gap, filled and packed, system holding, continue. The blizzard had been telling him for 4 days whether he had built correctly. So far it had told him yes. This is not where the story begins. 6 weeks before the blizzard's fourth night, the Whitmore Valley had been the specific amber of a northern October that has decided to be beautiful before it becomes difficult. Caleb Rourke had arrived at his claim in the second week of September with a wagon of tools, a plan he had been developing since the previous winter, and a disposition toward preparation that the valley's existing residents found either admirable or excessive, depending on whether they had yet formed a full opinion of him. He was 38 years old. He had come from the mill country of the upper Great Lakes, where he had spent 12 years as a timber framer, and where the winters had the specific quality of winters that produce, in the people who survive them repeatedly, either an enduring respect for thermal engineering or a relocation to a more southerly latitude. He had developed the enduring respect. What he had specifically developed, across 12 winters in mill country, and the sustained attention to what worked, and what did not that a person applies when what does not work has direct personal consequences, was an understanding of why single-wall log construction, the standard cabin construction of every frontier settlement he had encountered since leaving the lakes, was built to a standard that a mild winter could meet and that a severe winter could exceed. The single-wall cabin was built for the average winter. The average winter was not the problem. The problem was the winter that was not average, the sustained blizzard, the 7-day event, the cold that arrived and held for a duration that no reasonable October planning expected, because reasonable October planning is always calibrated to the winters a person has experienced rather than the winters that the climate of a place is capable of producing. He had experienced winters the Whitmore Valley had not. He had also experienced the specific failure mode of a single-wall log cabin in a sustained cold event. The way the cabin's interior temperature tracks the exterior temperature through the night when the stove is banked. The way the wood consumption required to maintain a habitable temperature rises toward what a person's supply cannot sustain when the cold holds long enough, the way a structure that is adequate for 4 days becomes inadequate on the 5th. His cabin was going to have 2 walls. He set the inner wall first, standard log construction, the cabin's structural frame, fitted and chinkled in the way that all the valley's cabins were fitted and chinkled. The outer wall went up 2 feet outside the inner wall's face, a second log course of the same height, creating a cavity between the two that he intended to fill before the snow arrived. The valley's residents watched this go up across September and October with the varying quality of attention that a new arrival's unconventional building choices receive, some curious, some skeptical. And one man named Silas Dunn, who operated the valley's primary trading post, and who expressed his assessment of the double-wall construction with the directness of a man who has operated a trading post long enough to have seen most varieties of frontier optimism and has formed opinions about their outcomes. Silas said, "You are spending 2 months building what a good chinkling job would accomplish in 2 days." Caleb said, "A good chinkling job closes the gaps between the logs. It does not slow the rate at which the cold moves through the logs themselves." Silas looked at the double wall. He said he supposed that was one way to think about it. He drove on. Caleb went back to the outer wall. He was not building for Silas's approval. He was building for February, and February had not yet arrived to deliver its verdict. The sawdust came from the valley mill. Not purchased, sourced, which was a different arrangement and a better one. The mill produced sawdust as an unavoidable byproduct of its operation, and had been managing the accumulation with the specific inconvenience of a material that is neither valuable enough to sell at a meaningful price nor compact enough to dispose of without effort. The miller, a practical man named Cord Hess, was willing to let Caleb take as much as he could haul in exchange for a morning's labor on the mill's draft clearing, which had been accumulating its own maintenance debt. Caleb hauled sawdust in October with the same methodical consistency he brought to everything. 6 loads across 10 days, more than the cavity required. Because a cavity calculation is always optimistic and sawdust settles, and a void in February is not the time to discover that the October calculation was insufficient. The filling technique required development. Loose-bored sawdust settled under its own weight, and under the compression that temperature cycling produced. The expansion and contraction of the material as it heated and cooled across repeated freeze-thaw cycles, creating the gradual compaction that eventually produced the void he would be filling on the 4th night of the blizzard. He discovered this in the first week, when he poured the initial fill into the cavity, and checked it a week later to find it had settled 4 inches below the top course. He refilled. He refilled again the following week, slightly less. He noted the settlement rate in the ledger and calculated the fill frequency required through winter to maintain the cavity at full effectiveness. Not daily, which was not practical, but a monthly check with repacking at any point where the settlement had created a void at the upper courses, which were the courses most exposed to the temperature differential that drove the settling. He also developed the packing technique that the October filling had not required, but that the gaps in the upper courses required. A wooden paddle of the specific width and length that allowed him to pack the sawdust into the cavity gap without the pressure that would compress the fill too densely and reduce its insulating value. The insulating value was in the air pockets. Pack too loosely and the air moved. Pack too densely and there was no air. The correct density was something he learned by feel across October, the same way he would apply it by feel on the 4th night of the blizzard. He ran the first thermal test in the last week of October, when the valley's first serious cold arrived. Not blizzard cold, but the genuinely cold nights of a northern October that put numbers on a thermometer that outdoor work the following morning confirms without needing to check. Interior temperature at 6 in the morning, before the fire was rebuilt, 41 degrees. Outside estimate, 18 degrees. 23 degrees of differential, before the morning fire, from a stove banked at the overnight rate. He noted this in the ledger, beside the October 28 entry. 23-degree differential maintained overnight. System performing above projection. Continue monitoring. Facts would speak before opinions ever could. The facts were beginning to speak. November delivered the refinement that October had not. Not the blizzard, that was January's work and January's alone. November delivered the sustained cold that sits below zero for a week without drama, the kind that does not produce memorable storms, but that measures a structure's performance more accurately than any single night can, because a single night is an event, and a week is a system test. Caleb ran the ledger through November. Wood consumption, morning temperature, outside temperature estimate, differential. Every morning, every entry. Not because he enjoyed record-keeping as an activity, he did not particularly, but because the record was the only honest account of what the system was doing, and the honest account was the only basis on which he could make the decisions the system required. The November figures showed two things. The first thing was that the double wall was performing as calculated. The wood consumption was running at approximately 60% of what he estimated an equivalent single-wall cabin would have required to maintain equivalent interior temperatures across the same period. 60% was not a trivial figure. It was the difference between a wood supply that lasted the winter and a wood supply that ran short in February. The second thing was a weakness. The door frame. He found it in the second week of November in the way that weaknesses reveal themselves in thermal systems, not through a dramatic failure, but through the specific pattern of a cold floor near the threshold that did not match the rest of the floor's temperature, a draft that was not present at the wall faces, but was present at the base of the door that the outer wall did not extend over because the outer wall had a door too, and the two door openings were offset but not sealed at the combined threshold. He noted it in the ledger. Door threshold gap, thermal bridge identified, cold ingress measurable at floor level, address before December. A weakness should not be allowed to hide behind success. He addressed it before December. A secondary threshold seal of the doubled felt material that the mill's packing room produced as waste, and that he had been collecting for exactly this kind of application, pressed into the gap at the combined threshold and tacked in place, so that the cold had no path through the offset door arrangement that the double wall's geometry had created. He tested the seal. The floor temperature at the threshold equalized with the surrounding floor within the same monitoring period. He noted the correction. Threshold seal installed and confirmed. System complete. Prepare for winter. Everything that could be prepared had been prepared. The blizzard's announcement arrived on the 7th of January. Not the blizzard itself, its announcement, in the specific meteorological vocabulary of a northern valley in January. The cloud formation from the northwest that the valley's oldest residents recognized as the precursor to a significant event, the temperature drop of 11 degrees in 4 hours on the afternoon of the 7th, the wind shifting from the southwest to the northwest in the way that indicates a system arriving rather than weather passing. Caleb read the sky on the 7th, the way he had learned to read it in the lake's country, not as a casual observer reads weather, but as a person reads it who has been made to understand that the difference between correctly reading and incorrectly reading has a cost. He read 3 to 7 days, sustained wind, temperature below zero for the duration. He spent the 7th and the morning of the 8th making the preparations the system required, not emergency preparations, because a system built for this event should not require emergency preparation when the event arrives, but the confirmatory checks that a person runs when the event is coming to ensure that what was built in October and refined in November is still what was built in October and refined in November. The sawdust cavity, sound at all accessible upper course checks. The threshold seal, intact. The stove, clean draft ready. The wood supply, stacked inside the outer wall's covered passage in the configuration he had designed specifically, so that the 7-day supply could be accessed without entering the full outdoor conditions that the blizzard would produce. The dog inside. The blizzard arrived in full force on the afternoon of the 8th. It did not arrive gently. Day 1 was loud. The wind found the outer wall with the specific force of a system that had been building for 300 miles of open country and had arrived at the first significant obstacle it encountered, which was the outer log wall of Caleb Rourke's double-wall cabin, and applied itself. The outer wall held. The inner wall held what the outer wall passed. What the outer wall passed, through 2 feet of sawdust-packed cavity and the inner wall's logs and chinking, was not the wind and not the blizzard temperature. It was a diminished version of both, the thermal residue of a severe event after the system designed to resist it had done its work. Interior temperature, morning of day 1, 42 degrees. He built the fire at the normal rate. By mid-morning, the interior was 58 degrees, and the stove was at its maintenance setting, and the wood consumption for the morning was what a normal winter morning consumed. He noted this in the ledger. Day 2 was harder. The temperature had dropped further overnight, and the wind had shifted slightly north, which directed the full force of the system's sustained energy against the northwest corner that he had identified as the primary exposure. The corner that 3 months of November and December monitoring had consistently shown as the single most demanding point in the structure's thermal performance. The northwest corner held. Interior temperature, morning of day 2, 40 degrees. He built the fire at the normal rate. By mid-morning, 56. He noted the 2-degree reduction from day 1 and calculated what it implied, not a structural failure, but a settlement in the upper northwest course that the 3 days of temperature cycling had produced. He noted the gap check for the first available repair window. Day 3, day 4. On the 4th night, at the 2nd hour, he went outside. It did not need to last forever. Only until the gap was filled, and the morning confirmed that the fill had held. He filled it, he came inside, he noted the ledger entry, he banked the stove, he slept. Morning of day 5, 43 degrees. The repair had held. He noted northwest corner gap, refilled night of day 4, temperature recovery confirmed day 5, system intact. Day 6 brought the hardest wind of the 7-day event, the sustained wall of pressure that the blizzard had been building toward since day 1. Delivered in the 6th day as though it had been conserving its full force for the moment, when a structure might be beginning to show the cumulative fatigue of sustained stress. Caleb's cabin was not fatigued. It was a system, not a structure. Systems do not fatigue the way structures do. They perform until a component fails, and the only component that had shown any movement was the northwest corner gap, and the northwest corner gap had been addressed. Interior temperature, morning of day 6, 42 degrees. Wood consumed to day 6, within the calculated 7-day supply margin. He noted both. Day 7 brought the wind's resolution, the specific reduction in sustained force that signals a blizzard's conclusion, not as a dramatic ending, but as a gradual release, the pressure easing across the morning hours, until by afternoon the valley was quiet in the specific way that a valley is quiet after 7 days of noise. Winter showed none. It had arrived with its full force and duration, had applied itself to every structure in the Whitmore Valley for 7 days, and had delivered its verdict on each one in the specific language of wood consumption and interior temperature and structural integrity that survives and structural compromise that does not. Caleb opened the cabin door on the morning of the 8th day. The valley below was a white field with chimneys. His was the only cabin he could see smoke rising from at the normal, steady rate of a stove managed through the night rather than the thicker, desperate rate of a stove being asked to compensate for everything the structure was failing to retain. He noted this too. Then he went to check the northwest corner in daylight. The valley took 3 days to dig itself out. Not from the snow alone, from the specific aftermath of a 7-day blizzard in a northern valley, which is a combination of snow management, structural assessment, livestock check, and the general accounting of what a week of sustained severe winter had asked of every person and structure in the settlement. The accounting was not uniform. 2 cabins in the lower valley had burned on day 3 and day 5 respectively. The specific outcome of stoves pushed beyond their safe operating rate by occupants who were burning what they had at the rate the cold required rather than the rate the stove permitted. No one had been lost, which was the outcome that mattered, and that the valley noted with relief before noting anything else. The wood supply situation was more varied. The families who had managed their consumption through the 7 days were the families whose structures had retained enough heat to make managed consumption possible. The families whose structures had not retained, whose single-wall cabins had tracked the outdoor temperature closely enough that the fire had to be run at a rate that was about compensation rather than warmth, had consumed at rates that had brought several of them to their supplies margin by day 7. Not all of them. Not the ones whose cabins were sound, and whose chinking was recent, and whose preparation had been thorough. But enough of them that the accounting was uncomfortable to complete. Silas Dunn arrived at Caleb's fence line on the 3rd day after the blizzard ended. He did not arrive with his opinion in the forward position. He arrived in the way of a man who has spent 7 days in a cabin that cost him more wood than he had intended, and who has had those 7 days to think about a conversation from October that he now has a different quality of information about. He asked how the double wall had done. Caleb showed him the ledger. 7 days of morning temperatures, 7 days of wood consumption, the northwest corner gap entry from night 4 with the repair noted, and the day 5 recovery confirmed. The final figure, total wood consumed across 7 days of blizzard below zero, expressed as a percentage of what a comparable single-wall cabin in the valley had consumed across the same period based on the figures 3 of his neighbors had shared when he asked. 61%. Silas read the figure twice. He looked at the double wall's exterior, the outer log course, its face intact, the gap he had been filling on the 4th night now packed and sealed and invisible behind the wood face. He asked about the sawdust. Caleb explained it, not the concept, which Silas understood now, but the specifics. The fill density required to maintain the air pockets that were the mechanism of the insulation. The settlement rate that monthly checks needed to address. The upper course vulnerability that the northwest corner had demonstrated, and that any double-wall construction in this valley should account for in its maintenance schedule. He explained it because Silas was going to build something, and the explanation was more useful to Silas than the satisfaction of withholding it. Facts would speak before opinions ever could. The facts had spoken. What remained was to make sure the right people heard them. 3 men in the Whitmore Valley built double-wall cabins the following summer. They all sourced sawdust from Cord Hess at the mill, who had by then formalized the arrangement into a standing agreement. Sawdust for labor, the labor applied to the mill's drainage maintenance that the single morning trade with Caleb had not fully addressed. Cord Hess also built a second storage structure that summer. Double-walled. He used the sawdust from his own operation to fill it, and noted, in a ledger he had not previously kept for such things, the wood consumption across the following winter compared to the single-wall barn he had been running for 6 years. The figure confirmed what Caleb's ledger had shown. Winter showed none. It did not show the weakness in a wall that had no weakness to show. It did not find the gap that had been filled, or the threshold that had been sealed, or the cavity that had been packed and repacked, until the settlement rate was understood and accounted for. It applied itself with the impartial severity that a blizzard applies to every structure in a valley, and it received, from Caleb Rourke's double-wall cabin, the specific response of a structure built for exactly this. He was, for the first time in the winter that had followed his arrival in the Whitmore Valley, exactly where he had meant to be. Not comfortable, a man who has been outside on a blizzard's fourth night packing sawdust into a wall gap by lantern and feel has earned the right to not call the outcome comfortable, but placed correctly, in a cabin that held, with a ledger that recorded what holding looked like and what it cost and what it did not cost compared to the alternative. The ledger was the argument. The blizzard had made the argument for him. He had simply built the cabin that let it.